Mr. President, yesterday, on the 12th of the Hebrew month of Cheshvan, the people of Israel mourned the second anniversary of the murder of Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Less than 2 weeks before his assassination, on October 24th, 1995, Prime Minister Rabin addressed the General Assembly on the occasion of the 50th anniversary of the United Nations. "We are grateful to you," he said, "for your encouragement and for standing at our side at the historic turning point unfolding on our plot of land." And he went on to praise the change in the relationship between Israel and the international community and the United Nations. 2 years on, as we face the third meeting of an emergency special session within 6 months, when the General Assembly can find no greater threat to international peace and security than the building of a residential neighborhood in Jerusalem, what has happened to that new UN attitude we glimpsed only 2 years ago? Mr. President, 2 years on, the United Nations is no longer at the forefront of the forces of peace. Instead, it is permitting itself to be abused again and again as part of a political campaign which threatens to turn the clock back to the decades of sterile and hostile debates in the international arena. This meeting of the emergency special session, like those which preceded it, is a masquerade. It claims to be concerned with advancing the prospects for peace. It claims to be concerned with increasing humanitarian protection. But in fact, it will only serve to undermine the prospects for peace, to undermine the instruments of humanitarian protection, and ultimately to undermine the United Nations itself. As for the draft resolution before this session, it bears little or no relation to the facts on the ground. Perhaps never has that dangerous gap between the General Assembly's perception of reality and reality itself been so wide. Last week, while Israeli and Palestinian negotiators in Washington resumed intensive efforts to bridge gaps between them, the Palestinian observer mission in the UN was feverishly occupied in preparing the resolution that stands before us. And this week, as this resolution that speaks of the, quote, stalled peace process, unquote, comes before us for discussion, Israeli and Palestinian negotiators have continued to meet on a daily basis to try and reach concrete agreement. At the very moment when Israeli negotiators are being asked, despite the heinous acts of terror that continue to take innocent civilian lives, to take risks for peace on vital issues of security, to enable safe passage through the heart of Israel, to enable a full-scale airport to begin operation in the Gaza Strip, to invest millions of dollars to create tens of thousands of jobs for Palestinians in the Carney Industrial Park. At that very moment, this assembly will broadcast its resonant voice of no confidence in the peace process. Mr. President, the ostensible pretext for this emergency session is Israeli settlement activity. But that too is a masquerade. In the Declaration of Principles between Israel and the PLO and the interim agreement that followed, Israel and the Palestinians agreed on two fundamental principles concerning settlements. The first, that there would be no restriction on settlement activity during the interim period. Indeed, in the course of these agreements, in the course of negotiating these agreements, the Palestinian side in 1994 and in 1995 dropped a proposal that would have barred the building of new settlements and the expansion of existing ones, agreeing to conclude and sign the agreements without such a specific provision. In presenting the interim agreement to Israel's Knesset in October of 1995, the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin stressed this fact, that the agreements contained no prohibition on settlement activity, referring to his, and I quote, commitment to the Knesset not to uproot any settlement in the framework of the interim agreement, nor to freeze construction and natural growth, unquote. This was stated just as the Knesset was discussing the interim agreement and decided to support it. In fact, the only building activity in the territories that has been in direct contravention of these agreements has been the massive Palestinian construction effected in violation of the agreed provisions concerning planning and zoning. In 1997 alone, 625 illegal Palestinian structures have been erected in Area C, that is the area of the West Bank under Israeli control. In Area B, in which the Palestinians have civilian and public order responsibility, and Israel has security control, the number of structures is in the thousands. What we have here is total asymmetry. Israel is being asked to freeze settlement activity while the Palestinians continue to build. Is that a level playing field? The second principle concerning settlements established in the Israel-PLO agreements was that settlements would be one of the subjects of negotiations between the two sides in the permanent status talks. On the date set for the start of these talks, Israel turned up, ready and waiting with a team of negotiators, but the Palestinian side never came. While Israel calls repeatedly for its Palestinian counterparts to join it in expedited permanent status talks, talks which would deal inter alia with the issue of settlements, the Palestinian side prefers to reject practical negotiations and opt instead for the fool's gold of political resolutions in international fora. Mr. President, the resolution before us poses a very simple question. Where will peace negotiations take place? Will they take place in the public international arena, where decades of resolutions like this one before us have not brought the Palestinian people 1 inch closer to the realization of their aspirations? Or will they take place in genuine face-to-face dialogue between the two sides? This is the point on which peace accords are abundantly clear. They provide that all outstanding issues between the two sides are to be resolved in direct bilateral negotiations, the only framework in which progress has ever been made. The draft resolution calls for re-injecting momentum into the peace process, but its effect will be exactly the opposite. To genuinely inject momentum into the process, the international community must send the Palestinian side back to the negotiating table, where they and we and the issues between us belong. Mr. President, the draft resolution calls for the convening of a conference of the high contracting parties to the Fourth Geneva Convention to ensure respect for the convention by Israel. One can only express astonishment at this newfound concern with enforcing the convention. Was such a conference convened when the Soviet Union invaded Czechoslovakia or when it invaded Afghanistan? Of course, today we are talking about a case of territories from which Israel was attacked in 1967 and which it entered in self-defense. In fact, the entire history of the convention, despite the many cases of actual occupation, only one state has actually implemented in practice the provisions of the convention relating to occupied territory: Israel. Even though, as Israel has explained many times in this chamber, the convention is not, strictly speaking, applicable to territories which were formerly occupied and not under a legitimate sovereign, Israel has implemented the convention in practice. Can the interests of the convention possibly be served by convening the high contracting parties to censure the one state that has sought to implement its provisions? And if, as the proponents of the resolution profess, their concern is with the humanitarian protection of the population of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, to who should their concerns be addressed? Following the Israeli-Palestinian agreements, virtually the whole of the Gaza Strip and a large part of the West Bank have been transferred to Palestinian responsibility. Today, and this may be a surprise to many, but today, over 95% of the Palestinians in the West Bank and the Gaza Strip live under Palestinian and not Israeli responsibility. But the most dangerous aspect of the draft resolution's proposal to convene a conference is that such a conference would constitute a dangerous mix of political and humanitarian spheres. The significant achievements of humanitarian protection have been based on the neutrality of humanitarian law and the organs which implement it. The politicization of the instruments of international law would only undermine their effectiveness and have far-reaching consequences, not merely in our region, but in cases of humanitarian need across the world. In short, this resolution is a blow to the defense of human rights. Mr. President, since the last meeting of the emergency special session, Israel has been the victim of brutal terrorist bombings in the heart of Jerusalem, in the Machane Yehuda market, and in the Ben Yehuda Street pedestrian mall. The perpetrators of these attacks did not come from abroad, but from the areas under the control of the Palestinian Authority. To this day, the Palestinian Authority has failed to comply with its commitment to combat systematically and effectively terrorist organizations and infrastructure, a specific Palestinian obligation that appears in the note for the record of January 1997. What kind of message does this special session send to Chairman Arafat regarding his non-compliance? The failure of the Palestinian Authority to comply with its security commitments to fight terrorism is not a debating point. We are talking about a situation that puts Israeli lives at risk. On August 5th, 1997, Mr. Arafat appeared on Palestinian television telling his Fatah movement in Gaza, and I quote, "It is important that we organize our homes and our movement so that we can more and more endure the coming battle, which we shall initiate." He then added, "The whole world stands by us while they are alone." This statement was repeated on August 6th in Al-Hayat al-Jadida. What message does this special session send to Mr. Arafat? To comply with his commitment to fight terrorism, or that violence against Israel and against Israelis will not be denounced? While the bombing of innocent Israelis and language of this sort erode the core of the Oslo process, the government of Israel is determined to make this peace process work. For this, we need the support of the international community and not the kind of act that is being proposed here today. The government of Israel remains committed to the Madrid invitation, which includes reference to UN Security Council Resolution 242 and 338, and to all signed agreements between Israel and all Arab parties. Mr. President, the one-sidedness of this session and the resolution before it reflect an approach that threatens to undermine not only the peace process and humanitarian protection, but also the very aspirations of the United Nations itself. Instead of being a tool for helping to build peace, this approach threatens to lead the United Nations to undo the work of decades and become merely an implement in the hands of political manipulators. I call on member states to resist this dangerous tendency and not to be a party to today's proposal and all that it stands for. In his concluding remarks to the General Assembly in 1995, the late Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin gave voice to the hopes of many for what this organ could be. Quote, "The main role of the UN," he said, "is to support the powers and the nations who are working for peace, to intensify the struggle against terror, to promote democracy, education, development, and to ensure the advancement of all mankind." Look at this session today, Mr. President. Where is the United Nations now? Thank you.
I thank the representative of Israel.